fundamentally what PRC and the Russian Federation want to do, and they basically said this a couple of years ago, they want to change the whole international world order. They're all for the rule of law, but they want it to be their rules. That is the underlying that is the underlying motivation. That's why it's important to get back to the moon. That's why it's important not to underestimate. I want to be clear. I'm not a China hater. I don't hate anybody. The only thing I hate is when I compare outer space to the Earth. I hate that.
But you did a great job doing that with the South China Sea. I think that made it really intelligible. So it's nice that you really sunk into what you hate the most.
But I still hate it. I don't get up in the mirror and saying those damn Chinese, they're the lowest form of life. I don't. They have their state. I understand. They are a state and they have their interests. I don't agree with their interests, and the U.S. But the U.S. has its interests as well. I respect them for the simple fact is they will look at every angle and they're not afraid to take action on that angle instead of just wringing their hands. Well, what if we offend somebody? I can guarantee you. I tell people, look, if you're going to ask me a question, be careful because you may not like the answer because I'm going to be honest with about it. I offend people all the time. I'm not very popular in this field because I am very straightforward with it. I don't get into political narratives or platitudes. I'm very blunt and to the point. I'm that way in my law practice too. So, but I respect them for the fact that they have state interest. I respect them for the fact that they're proactive and they're not afraid to try something. They're very assertive. That aside, I love being an American. My father was an immigrant from Austria, and I'm first generation. I love my country, and I try to help my country, by promoting these ideas, about national security and national defense. And again, it's not this whole thing that I hate China, I hate Russia.
I mean, I guess I feel like the fact that you even have to come out with this big disclaimer about how you don't hate China or Chinese people is a demonstration of the success of their political warfare,
Precisely.
Right? That they can use
Precisely.
that to attack people.
Well, I'm not, basically the whole NGOs in outer space security right now is about we're one world. We got to come together. We got to preserve space for the common good. That's rubbish. And the Chinese feed on that rubbish. You feed on that very nicely. It's a simple matter of we have state interest, we have our way of life, and we want to preserve that way of life. And we got to make sure our interests in space are met, while at the same time while making sure that the PRC, the Russian Federation, what have you, their interests aren't conflicting or basically trying to overwrite our interests. Again, it's all about state interest. That's how the world runs.
So if our viewers or listeners wanted to hear more of your thoughts, where should they go?
Well, you can follow me on LinkedIn. I have a website, www.spacelawsolutions.com. I have a briefing letter called The Pressy that I put out quarterly that you can subscribe to. Yes, unfortunately, it is a paid subscription, but I put a lot of work into it. But that gives you my insights that I don't publish anywhere else. I am. If you put my name in a search engine, you'll come up with a lot of my papers. I do have a YouTube channel called Space Thoughts, which I'm probably going to start getting back into in the next month or so. Where I just basically lay out. Well, I basically call it like I see it, and it might offend you. So you might have you should be forewarned that might offend you with my ideas or my thoughts on things. But those are the best ways to do it. Again. If you're free to try and connect with me on LinkedIn if you like. Of course, I have the discretion of whether or not I will accept a connection because I am very careful about who I actually connect with on social media.
Well, I hope everyone watching will at least subscribe to the YouTube channel. Give you a little boost there. But yeah, it's been a pleasure having you on.
Thank you for having me.
I think it's really interesting, his whole thing about mirror thinking. Like that's definitely it's so easy to fall in that trap of everyone thinks like me.
Yeah, I do think that is like a very human thing to do.
Yeah,
is to not be able to look outside yourself and be like, do other people treat this differently? Maybe.
Yeah, and so that is a real problem. I mean, I think the great example is Mao and nuclear warfare. Like, if the U.S. lost 500,000 people in a nuclear war, that would be devastating.
I mean, there aren't 500.
I know, it would be especially devastating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's just, easy, though, in the Mao example to be like, oh, well, like Mao was crazy dictator, right? You know, and not to understand that, like, actually this entire, like, the entire communist system is built on thinking like this. It's not just like Mao was one individual crazy leader who, a megalomaniac kind of person.
Right,
Yeah,
but he
it's struggle is
established a
fundamental.
system where the people who think in that sort of sadistic, sociopathic way can much more easily rise to the top. And that's why we've seen every leader since Mao also be involved in one or more extremely brutal acts of murder, torture, and so on. Right? Like that's just the whole thing. You can't escape that.
You almost make the CCP sound like some kind of frat where like the hazing ritual is to go commit like a small genocide, you know, like just
Right,
against
like
the
Hu
Tibetans.
Jintao, the Tibetans, right? And then this little genocide, and then he gets promoted, and he's chairman, and then now he can commit further genocide. Yeah, it is actually a good example. It's like a frat, but worse.
What were you saying earlier about it would be good if we didn't go off the rails at the end?
Yeah. I had a thought, and then I was watching us go off the rails, and then that thought got left behind.
I'm sorry. I think that was my fault for the frat thing, but I do think it's an interesting analogy.
Yeah, and I mean, you do see that with the climate stuff. Like, obviously, the Chinese Communist Party does not care about climate change, and if we keep approaching, if we have to work with China, I remember what I was going to say. It's the whole problem with this end of history nonsense that has really dominated the Western thinking.
Yeah,
for
well,
so
I
long.
feel like it's starting to come away from that. I think there's, I think it started like actually being codified into policy under the Trump administration, where they had a paper on China, a strategic paper that came out and said, look, this is about great power competition.
Mm-hmm.
Like and that is like a different worldview than the idea of like, global cooperation, this kind of UN, like world peace.
We're just all
kind
going to
of
work
idea.
together for economic benefit.
That we kind of like grew up learning about, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that was a big issue in the Trump administration with, for example, NATO. Like Trump demanding NATO allies pay their fair share for the military. And like especially Germany really resented that idea because it's the end of history. We don't need to have these military.
Kind of ironic that it was Germany, actually.
But but I mean they should have already realized that didn't make sense after Putin invaded Crimea. But like obviously now with the Ukraine war, I think that people are kind of realizing that like wait, maybe we aren't all just going to work together for economic prosperity.
But I think the problem is that you have all these people in, like, for example, in the Foreign Service in the U.S. or in the State Department or these places where they have grown up learning about the end of history or this kind of philosophy. So now to kind of be like, all right, actually, it is about state interests and power competition and all this stuff.
Yeah, it was interesting that Michael used the example of, like in his terror scenario, that it began with like the spy balloon figuring out where these locations are.
Mm-hmm.
Because like the Biden administration tried to cover it up. Like that's come out now. Like they didn't want that getting public because it was like, oh, why is this a big deal?
Well, I mean, also they wanted to
talk to China.
Yeah, I mean, Blinken was supposed to go to China, so
yeah, they didn't want to interfere with that. And that's still kind of that's whole like, well, we got to do diplomacy, we got to talk. Talking is the most important thing. But if you look at it outside of the lens of this end of history thing and realize like, oh, this is actual strategic information they're getting. This could be used for very nefarious things. We shouldn't just try to cover it up.
Yeah, I think also things like you brought up climate change. I think this is a case in which the CCP was really able to manipulate John Kerry in particular by, he had this relationship with the Chinese climate negotiator that had been going on for over a decade. And then after John Kerry left the State Department, right, and then when he came back as the Biden administration's climate czar, the CCP pulled that same guy out of retirement to talk to John Kerry again. So it's kind of like understanding this idea of personal relationships and the idea that it may be Kerry might feel more amenable if he's dealing with the same guy.
We're just all people.
who's been talking to him for so long, and they feel like they get along, and they can, even if their governments are not, like on a personal level,
Yeah, it's amazing. Like the Chinese Communist Party really understands the story that we tell ourselves, and then is manipulating that pretty well. I don't know why they know us so well, but we don't know them. I guess we know them.
Well,
do they know us?
Do they know us?
Do they know me?
Do you know you? Oh God, this is getting deep.
Well, I do think that. That's what we've been trying to do for a decade now, right?
Yeah.
Is getting people to understand the CCP. But I think I don't know. I mean, I think there's a bunch of psychological things that go into why we don't understand them as well as they understand us. And I think some of it is the political warfare directly done by the CCP in the form of trying to make themselves look like us to us. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think also the majority of people on the planet, I believe, want peace, right? And there's a much smaller minority of people who want war and aggressive action. But it's so easy for a small number of aggressive people to start conflict because anyone can start conflict. It's much harder to maintain peace, and often peace needs to be maintained through a type of strength, right? Whether it's military or other strength. And I think that's kind of the disconnect. So the point I'm making is that it's very hard for people who want to live in a sort of kumbaya world, and I do, to understand how just lopsided it is, how really the small number of people really don't care at all about that, and they want to dominate. And those people have risen to the top.
I feel like the problem with your analogy is that it's like the thing that's happening is that essentially the CCP can do things like weaponize the use of the idea of peace, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, anyway, I don't know where I was going with that.
Which is actually the point that I was attempting to make but did not.
Well, I think even the idea that, most people want peace, that's even like an assumption that I don't think existed at a certain point in history. Like, Caesar became a hero after he murdered 1 million Gaul and enslaved 1 million more. And that wasn't just like, him. That was everyone like, hey, this guy, he's beloved of the gods. So I don't even know if like this whole peace thing, like, I don't think that's like a fundamental, just it naturally exists amongst humanity.
Don't worry, we've channeled all that aggression into professional sports in the U.S.
So if we get rid of the sports, if China knocks out the Super Bowl, then all that contained lust for blood will be unleashed.
Yeah, so that would be a very serious miscalculation.
The most serious of all.
I did not know where that was going to go, but yeah, you kind of brought it back.
I brought it back. Before we get more off the rails, I think this is a good time to end.
I was going to suggest, Chris, that you might want to go to, since Michael compared the South China Sea to the moon and outer space, that maybe it's time to go plant the China Uncensored flag on the moon. Oh
yeah, I was thinking of that. I did plant my flag on the Scarborough Shoal, and that was a territorial claim.
Okay, that wasn't just, pride in our show, making it to the South China Sea.
I own the Scarborough Shoal.
I feel like our Filipino audience is going to have something to say about that.
You should be happy. It's not China.
Yeah, you're protecting it from China.
Yeah, that's right.